All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us on your Sunday morning on the last day of our FMJ Summit to talk about, I can't quite promise all issues relating to social class in museums, but certainly as many of them as we can fit into this hour. I think it's really important to say up front a couple of things. The first thing is social class is not one of the protected characteristics. Secondly, you can't tell what social class somebody is by looking at them or by a lot of things about them that you might assume. But social class is what underpins a lot of our interactions and assumptions, especially at work. It's in language, action, behavior, assumption, expectation, and many more. I'm really pleased to have our panel here to discuss all of this today. And I'm going to ask our panel to introduce themselves. So tell us who you are, what you do in the sector or not in the sector, and kind of what are the key issues you really want to make sure we cover in this session. And I'm going to come to Vikki first.
Hi everyone, I'm Vikki Jessop. I've worked in museums since I was 16, but I recently left the sector. So I work at an auction house now. I joined Christie's in March to be their head of art handling. But at the same time, I became a trustee of the Black Country Living Museum in Dudley. And I am working class.
Thanks a lot, Vikki. Lorraine, I'll come to you next.
Good morning, everybody. Happy Sunday to you too. My name's Lorraine Finch. I'm an accredited conservator. And for the last 17 years, I've been a freelance conservator running my own business. I started in the museums world in 1995, so 25 years now. And if you include my 2 years of training, that's 27 years. And in a panel on Friday, I did feel like the grandmother, with people saying that they were 6 years, 8 years and 16 years, well, 27 years. So yes, hello from the grandmother. In terms of my background, as Louise was saying, this is one of the things you can't tell from looking at somebody what their background is. And so I grew up in my nanny's council house. My dad was a taxi driver and my mum was a cleaner. So that's me in a nutshell. And I look forward to having a really good discussion with you all.
Thank you so much, Lorraine. And Kathleen, can you introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, I'm Kathleen. I am a freelance curator and collections manager. I've been working in museums for about just over 10 years and I've been freelance for the last couple of years. So that's me, but I'm also here as a representative today of Museum Muck, which is the network for working class museum people. And I can share a bit more about Museum Muck for people who don't know as we go on through that.
Great, thank you so much. We're going to come straight into our questions because we've got quite a few to go through. And we'll start with an easy question with a lot of answers, I think. How does social class impact, I'm going to say, the museum workforce in the widest sense of the question? And I'm going to come back to Kathleen as you're unmuted.
Okay, set myself up for that. So I think the first and probably most obvious thing to say is it shows itself in the attitude to money and compensation within the museum sector. There's this understanding that everyone has to volunteer in order to get experience, which completely neglects the fact that people have to earn money to pay their bills and pay their way. And I think that everyone just kind of glosses over that. It's something that people don't like to kind of talk about and touch on. But apart from money, there's also, so when we talk about class, there's, classically, there's three things. There's like economic capital, social capital, and cultural capital. So in terms of social capital, I think that people who are from a working class background are less likely to know other people who work in the cultural sector or in museums specifically. So you're less likely to have those networks to build on to help you get your first foot in the door.
Definitely. And I've just put in the chat a link to the Panic report from now a couple of years ago, although it feels like 2 minutes ago that it was published, which will give some insight into some of those things Kathleen was mentioning there, especially about who do you know and who did you know growing up, what jobs did they do. I'm going to come on the same question to Vikki.
As in how I understand social class within museums. From my, I was just saying to the panel before we started the session that I hadn't really thought too much about class until a few years ago when I actually heard about museum as Muck when I worked at the British Museum. I think it's, I feel that I always stood out in when I started working in museums and galleries, and I think you can, and I hadn't quite realised that I was different to all my peers up until I started working in museums. So like growing up in a council estate and going to a comprehensive school, I thought was really normal and how most people were raised. And it wasn't until I got my first, well, it wasn't until I started volunteering in museums on top of working evening shifts in a bar to pay bills, that I realised just how different I was from like the people who were doing like internships there and who had like entry level jobs, that their background was just so much more different. I hadn't even been on a foreign holiday or anything like that, and I think it was just, I don't know, I considered that I was normal and that was just how everyone was raised up until I started working in museums and galleries. And then I compare myself to my peers who had, their upbringing was just obviously so much more different, and their level of education was different, and their parents were different, and their parents weren't cleaners, and all those sorts of things. And I guess I hadn't realised just how big and how important of a topic it was. I guess not to go off on a tangent too much, but yeah, on Kathleen's note about volunteering, it's just sort of expected that to get your foot into the sector, you've got to work for free. And it might be a bit controversial, but I think, I don't, even now, like over a decade into my career where I'm a trustee at a museum, I mean, that's obviously voluntary. And I feel like in some respects, volunteering is important, but there are so many instances even now where it's people are taking advantage with recruitment and how they advertise roles for entry level jobs, how they're asking for like postgraduate qualifications and many years of experience, then like the salary is £15,000 or something crazy. Anyway.
No, you're absolutely right, and we're going to come into some of that practice, I think, through the rest of our discussion, definitely. And we definitely are going to come back to talking a bit more about the unpaid labour in the sector and what that means for people as well. Lorraine, could I come to you? What other ways do you find that social?
So one of the ways that I think having the social class impacts museum workers is the lack of diversity. So I was reading the PEC report from the creative industry. So it's the creative industries as a whole. But one of the statistics they do have in there does relate to museums, libraries and galleries. So in 2018, according to their research, 23% of 23 to 69-year-olds, so a good range of people working in museums, libraries and galleries identified as working class, in comparison to 48% who identified as privileged. But the other thing is that might be because there's a lot of people around the 23 to 30-year-old age group, but there's very few at the 69-year-old age group or later stage, because I think there's a huge attrition rate of people that come from a working class background, because you get frustrated, partly because you feel you don't fit in, but also because it's very difficult to progress because of your background. And I do feel that that's one of the reasons why I became freelance, having thought about it later, that in order to be able to engage in a sector that I absolutely love, but on my terms, freelancing was the way to do it. So yeah, I think, there's a lack of diversity, there's a huge attrition rate of people, and then there's a lack of progression. One of the things is that the staying silent, because you become aware of your differences. And I have to say, I didn't really feel a difference until I started training at Camberwell. So I did my master's in conservation at Camberwell, and that was where it really started to dawn on me that somehow that there was a difference between me and the people that I was training with and would be working with. That made me go silent, and I stopped speaking up, not speaking up about my background, but just speaking up in general. So rather than pushing myself forward and speaking up, I stayed silent because I somehow didn't feel it was my place. It just felt wrong and I felt uncomfortable. So those are a few of the examples that I have of how social class impacts museum workers, but I'm sure there are a lot more.
Yeah, and there's some interesting queries being put in the chat, which I think are going to come up shortly too. I am going to now run a poll. We want to know, hang on, let me bring it up on screen. For everyone who's attending this session, we're going to ask you one of the standard questions that are used to assess social class in sort of demographic and statistical modeling. So I am going to launch this poll out to you all now. And you should have a look, read and pick the answer. It will tell me when people have voted. And this is for two reasons, really. We want to know who has chosen to attend this session. So are people looking for support from us, or are you someone who would consider yourself upper middle class looking to be challenged? Are you working class looking for support? Something in between, a bit of both? Just trying to get a bit of an overview of who has attended. I'll wait for a few more people to fill it in. We've got 3/4 of you have done it now, so we're nearly there. Just to note, it's completely anonymous. We can't see who's filled it in, just how many people and what answers have been given. So you're not committing anything to the public world by doing the poll. All right, I think we are about stalled at this number. So I'm going to end the poll, and I'm going to share the results in just a moment. But I think a really good point has just been put up in the chat that class as it's experienced in the UK is a whole is its own special sausage, for lack of a better phrase. It is not common. It's not the same understanding of class as might be found internationally, and it does seem to be very specific. And we are going to focus in this session on social class in the UK understanding of the term. Fair Museum Jobs is a UK-based organisation. All of us are UK-based museum professionals, and that is kind of where we are going to focus. I will say that just to avoid confusion. I'm going to share the results of the poll, and we've got quite an interesting mix, I think. You should all be able to see the results of the poll now. So this is about, I think 85% of the people who are here responded. So we've got a bit of a mix of people who have put themselves at the top end and then through into the middle. It's sort of I'm not sure if this mix isn't representative, I think, necessarily of museum workers, but whether you would get that on a Sunday morning is a whole different question as well. Yeah, and someone has DM'd me in the chat to point out that actually the answer for them, none of these answers represent their experience of when they were 14, and that is one of the key issues here, is that the questions that are available around social class don't measure every option, and indeed even deciding which question to use for that poll was a 5-email back and forth with attachments and reviews from Office of National Statistics paperwork, because it is quite complex. I'm going to come to Kathleen, I think. Wonder if you want to reflect at all on that poll and the questioning itself.
Sure. So that question is the preferred measure that for Museum as Muck, where we have discussed it as a steering group, that is a measure that which we feel does reflect a good way to measure class, and that's because it's about people's class background. So there is an argument that museum work in general is poorly paid, and if we're anyone who's working in a museum working for an employer who doesn't, you know, own the means of production, they are by that definition working class, and they're not well paid, so therefore we're all working class. But actually what I think is important is, in terms of diversity, is people's class background, which means that people who've come from different backgrounds have the opportunity to be part of the cultural sector. And I think the reason it's 14 is to do with your kind of life chances at that stage, and the decisions you're making about your future education and career, and the people that you know and are being raised by at that age is a good indicator of your kind of economic as well as social and cultural capital. Having said all that, Arts Council, I think, have recommended a version of that measure, but they have been very slow to roll it out. I think it's currently recommended as an option maybe for national portfolio organisations, but it's not yet mandatory in their reporting. And it's something that is like, people are very reticent about taking it on. So yeah, that's where we're kind of at as a sector.
And there are some other suggestions and suggested issues with that question coming up in the chat, and a suggestion from how they do it in the education sector about pupil premium or first generation to university. And I can reflect from my cultural organisation that one of the questions that they used is, when you were 14, were you eligible for free school meals? As another example of ways that question can be answered. And usually there's a few questions, and mixed together they can magically with a formula produce a result, is the impression I got from doing some reading about this. It's very complicated. I'm going to come on to one of our other questions, and I would just like to take a moment for all of my panel to just share a specific time where you've really experienced firsthand an impact of social class in any of your workplaces. And I'm going to come to Lorraine first. So a time it's happened to you.
I would say that it really isn't specific. It's just been a drip, drip, drip over the years that I've just felt that I've become aware of the differences. So like I said, when I started training at Camberwell, most of the women on my course were middle class to upper class. What I became aware of was it's a difference in expectations. They just expected things to happen, and I didn't. There were just expectations of a life plan or a life flow that they would follow that I would never follow. And even things like Vicky was saying about foreign holidays. Well, we never did excuse me, we never did foreign holidays. My dad was a taxi driver. The summer holidays were at the time when he earned his money, because we lived in a seaside resort. So we never took a family holiday. We never took a summer holiday. Had to save up to go on the school holidays if they went abroad. So I did go to Switzerland and France. And it was simple things like, they read Alice in Wonderland and Winnie the Pooh when they were kids. And I didn't read Winnie the Pooh until I was in my 20s, because suddenly I thought maybe I should, because all of the people that I was with had read it, and it was just a natural. And so it was just this feeling of, we had come from different places. We were now in the same place, but we'd come to it from a different place. And we were probably going to go in different directions because of that background. And I have to say that, we might be coming on to this later, that coming from a working class background and working in a middle class privileged profession, I fit in neither now. And I don't know if anybody else on the panel has that same sense, that yes, I still have friends who I grew up with, and my most long-standing friend I've known since I was 3, but I don't fit anywhere. And I don't know if anybody else feels that same sense of, it's not isolation or alienation, it's just not really fitting anywhere anymore.
I can definitely identify with that for sure. I'm having a lot of thoughts and feelings about that at the moment. Vicky, I wonder if you could share some of your experiences.
Yep. Yeah, that's a really interesting point about, I mean, would you call it social mobility, where it was evidently brought up without much money, and now the things that I do, you wouldn't really define as typically working class, like going to museums and galleries and the theatre. I think one of the key point that came to mind of being from a different background in the sector was probably when I first tried to get my foot in the door to National Museum in London. And I am from Dudley originally, but moving to London, I didn't go to university. I couldn't afford to go to university, so I did an apprenticeship. And I remember going to the interview and, you know, clearly not from London. And I was so, well, how, that there are obviously some difficulties in moving to London. And they said that typically what they expect apprentices to do is to have support from their parents financially, or to have parents who live in London, or family who can help them out. And I didn't have any of that. And I think, yeah, that's like a really good example for me, is just not being able to properly get my foot into the sector, because my parents would definitely not support me financially, like they wouldn't be able to. And I think that was the most difficult thing.
I think that's definitely an important reflection. Like, we talk about apprenticeships and traineeships as ways to democratize routes in, but they aren't always as democratizing as you would want them to be. They aren't opening up every door. For some people, it might actually be easier to get grants and loans to do a degree than it is to support yourself doing a traineeship. They are not there are challenges with all the options, for sure. Kathleen, I wonder if I could come to you, talk a bit about your experiences.
Yeah, so I just want to preface this by saying, we touched on this a little bit at the beginning about how you can't always tell what someone's class is, that I don't want people who are working class in the sector to feel like they have to justify themselves as being working class and to rake over all of their hardships in order for people to listen to them. Having said that, I've volunteered to be on this panel, and I'm happy to disclose some stuff about my background. So I grew up in a single parent household where my mother didn't work. And when I was 18, there was a family breakdown, is the phrase, I believe. Basically, I had to move out. I'm estranged from my parents, and I was staying with the parents of my then, my teenage boyfriend. So effectively, that's, it's kind of what people refer to as hidden homelessness, as I was never sleeping rough. I was never, didn't have a roof over my head, but I was in a very precarious situation. And since then, I've been on my own, supporting myself, in effect. So what you refer to there with the traineeships and that kind of thing, I was never in a position where I could take a low paid or a apprenticeship wage job. I always had to be working. But when it came to university, I could take out a loan, and I could get the maximum amount of student loan because I didn't have, in effect, didn't have parental support. So I was given the maximum amount of support from the government then, which is less now than it was when I was applying. And then when I did my MA, I paid for it with a credit card, and I, eventually paid it off. So there's ways around it that people find, that I've found, but it means that I have effectively got myself into debt to work in this sector. And if you compare that and balance that with someone who, and not to, criticize them personally, but someone who has a completely different family situation, who has parents who are willing and able to help them to, you know, let them live at home when they're doing these volunteering and internships. Like, that is not a level playing field by any means. And that's what we're dealing with when we talk about class. It's not like, I don't want to invalidate someone who comes from a traditional working class background, but had a, you know, they might have had a very stable family life, and but still kind of faced barriers because of their class. But it is that I think there are quite a lot of people who come from a working class background and actually have had a really shit time of it. And people, because people know that I'm associated with Museum as Muck, people have come up to me and told me these stories because they feel that it's a safe space to share this quite traumatic stuff. So it's a hard thing to talk about because it brings out all of this kind of trauma.
Yes, Lorraine, I'll come to you. You've got your hand up.
I just wanted to pick up on something that you said, Louise, about the democratising effect of apprenticeships and the various initiatives that are coming through the museum sector at the moment. I work as an assessor for various different training schemes in order to help people from diverse backgrounds to get a foot in the door. But it's been my experience with apprenticeships that when the apprenticeships were offered, that the people who were awarded the apprenticeships already had a first degree. They already came from the background that was similar to everybody else in the museum anyway. And that horrifies me because that's not what an apprenticeship should be about. The apprenticeship is a way of trying to make the playing field more level, but they've completely subverted that.
Yeah, I think the idea of leveling the playing field is a really important one, and we're going to come on to that in some of our other questions. I think something I really want to pick up on that's being reflected in the chat and from something that you said as well, Kathleen, is about the concept of precarity. And someone in the chat is reflecting about the emotional stress of paying through university in comparison to people who didn't. And I think there's something really important to acknowledge about when you do and don't have to think about money as a factor in your decision making. And it's as Kathleen said about choosing to go into debt, choosing your way to do things to get the thing that you want, where you know other people in the sector it wasn't even a choice for them. It wasn't even a, oh no, what do I do? It was just I don't even need to worry about what I'm going to do. That's just how it is. And I think the question of precarity really brings me on a lot to my next question about kind of the intersection of class and other things like gender, as has come up in the chat, but ethnic background, disability. And at this point, I'm going to say, yes, we are 4 white women talking about social class. That is what is happening, and we know that's not what we might have wanted to have offered on this panel, but it is what we are offering. So we are all aware of our own identities and the limits of what we are and aren't able to talk about. And that's why I really want to come to this question now to talk about that intersection of class with other identities, and actually what we could do that will help everyone from any identity across the board in working practice. Any volunteers to take this question on first?
I'm happy to go.
Okay, Lorraine.
So what actions can we take to improve the diversity and how comfortable people feel once they're in the sector? The first thing is not to make any assumptions. You know, you don't know people's backgrounds, you don't know what they've come from, what they've experienced. So don't make the assumption that just because you see, as I said earlier, somebody, you know, if you talk to me now, you can't hear my background, you can't hear my rural Norfolk accent. I look like a white privileged woman, but you don't know anything about me or my background. So don't make assumptions about people. they might be the same as you, they might be completely different, but get to know people and talk to them. And then think about people, other people and their needs. But the other thing that I found is something that I've been guilty of is not speaking up, actually. So in terms of talking about social class, it's taken me a good 20 years to feel comfortable about talking about my social class and my working class background. And I will quite happily now hold my hand up and say, yes, I come from this background. And there might be more of us out there from all different sorts of backgrounds than we give credit for, but people don't feel comfortable. And if we speak up, that will give other people the opportunity to speak up as well and to feel comfortable. So we had a discussion on Twitter. There was somebody put a question on there about, and I can't remember what it was about. And I said, hey, I'm working class, and stuck my hand up. And somebody else then said, oh, I'm so pleased you said that. She said, because I've been thinking and feeling exactly the same thing, but I've kept quiet about it. And it goes, we also had a question prior to the panel regarding how there are people from other social backgrounds or social classes in higher positions. How do we know? Because if they're not speaking up, how do we know? How if they're not speaking up, they're not being a role model to anybody else. So speak up, you know, be loud and proud.
I think there's a really interesting kind of middle ground between wanting people to speak up and knowing who is there and who has got where you might want to go. And then the point that Kathleen made earlier about how actually none of us have a responsibility to wear all of our identities on our sleeves at all times. And it is it's a personal balance for everybody on making that decision. I wonder, Kathleen, if I could come to you, and maybe this is a good point to reflect on some of the work of Museums Muck, I think, in talking about identity.
Yeah, sure. So I've put a couple of screenshots in the chat of some stats about intersectionality and class. And at Museums Muck, we've always been very careful to make it clear that we take an intersectional view of class. Because I think there is a tendency in the wider like public discourse to talk about white working class people as a distinct group, when in fact, if you look at the demographics who are affected by particularly economic hardships, disproportionately people who have different protected characteristics are more likely to be experiencing economic hardship. And that's one of the slides that I popped in the chat. But sorry, my cat's just appeared. I'm hoping he's not going to hop up on the screen. I think that, sorry, I've lost, what we need to remember when we're talking about intersectionality is it's not just a case that, oh, people have lots of different identities and that's nice, it's a big rainbow. Is that actually those different intersections are compounding disadvantage and barriers. So although there are members of Museums Muck, who I know are also members of Museum Detox, you have to acknowledge that people who are people of colour and from a working class background are going to face more barriers to being in the museum sector. Therefore, there are currently less of those people. And I think that we have to take all of these different factors into account when we're talking about class, so that we are not excluding those people from different groups.
Yeah, I think that's incredibly important, and to think on that as well. I don't want to say in every session, especially this year, but given what we're seeing in museums of all sizes in terms of redundancies, and who is being impacted by that, when you're making your front of house team, your learning team, your outsourced workers as well. We already know that some of that is impacting particular groups more heavily, but actually we are never going to know how that is impacting social class representation in the sector, because that information isn't being collected and isn't available. So we can assume what might be the case, but we can't know what the sector is going to look like in those terms, and how many careers are going to be prematurely terminated effectively because we're going to lose a set of people who aren't going to progress. And that is one of the questions that we've been asked, and I'd like to come to Vikki on this question, if that's okay. Someone submitted in advance the question: would the panel like to discuss why the majority of working class museum workers do not progress beyond entry level roles? And I know Lorraine has touched on, actually, do we know if that's true? But Vikki, I wonder if you could share some additional thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question. I was talking to the panel just before that. I was thinking more about that question last night and thinking, oh, do working class people like get to directors' positions? And I was up late last night looking on the National Museums Directors Council and just found myself like Googling every single director to see what their background was. And you can't tell if they're from a working class background. I mean, it's obvious for the ones that are middle class and from upper middle class backgrounds, because it will list their Oxbridge education or where they went to school. But I think people need to be more transparent. It would be so much more helpful to our sector if people were more clear and more open about their upbringing. And I think in terms of improving things, I think we need to stop hiring people who look the same as us. I mean, it was quite interesting in the Panic report, if you read it, that it discusses what the most successful people who were part of that discussion, the ones who were earning the £50,000, the ones who were directors, they stated that the only reason that they've got to that position is through hard work and perseverance. And you think, oh, okay, that's great. So if I work really hard, I will become a director of a museum. But then when you look at all the people who have reached that level of seniority, they've had different opportunities to everyone else. And I think the second that you're in a better position of power, the second that you're in a management role, you need to level the playing field more. You need to be more open, and I don't know whether the right way to say it is abuse your position of power, but make things more equal. Try and do some good. Try and hire people on fair wages. Yeah, it's tricky. I think, coming back to that, so I'm not going off on a tangent. I think people just need to be more transparent. I think it's a mixture of a lot of things. But I think there are just different opportunities for those middle class backgrounds. It's different education, different opportunities, and money makes a huge difference. And I think people just need to be more open.
Definitely, I think that's really important food for thought. If you are in a position where you could affect change, why aren't you if you're not? And how are you if you are? It's kind of a two-sided question there. If you're not affecting change, what's stopping you? It's not that it's straightforward to do that, but actually, don't we all, regardless of any of our characteristics at any point, don't we all owe it to each other and for the museum professionals coming after us to make the sector better? I think that's why we set up Fair Museum Jobs, because we could see problems and we needed to have something to help us do that. And I think it's very difficult. Lorraine, I wonder if I could come to you on that same question again, if you have anything else you could add to that.
So I touched on it when I first spoke about the attrition rate. So are there people from the working classes to take on those higher positions? Somebody else is saying about women and childcare, and having your in the chat about your careers stalling because of that. So that, there are lots of other issues that affect people on their progression through the career. one of the things that I remember very clearly from when I was training at Camberwell, I was staying in a house with a couple, and they had Nicholas Sirota over for tea. So they had a dinner party and Nicholas Sirota was there. And it's about connections, isn't it? You know, we still live in a world where it's not what you do, it's who you know. And yeah, as coming from a working class background, what networks do you have that is necessarily going to get you into those higher positions?
Yeah, I think thinking about networking is a really good point. And Kathleen, I wonder if you could say, I know from my experience of being involved in Museum as Muck as a kind of, I guess member is the word I'm looking for, that there is a supportive environment, and it does help make some of those networks that you might not already have. I know there's people offering when there's a job vacancy, if people in Museum of Muck have been interested, to give a bit more information about that. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about that as well.
Yeah, so it's not specifically something that we as a network kind of do and set out in our aims. And actually there was a conversation quite early on where our founder, Michelle McGrath, she was having some mentoring herself in her professional career. And the person she was working with suggested to her that mentoring for working class people might be a good solution to help people develop some of those soft skills. However, we were all quite ambivalent about it, because I think there is an argument that just teaching working class people to act like middle class people isn't resolving the structural issues. And also you can't, although you can develop relationships with a mentor, you can't mentor your way into being personal friends with Nicholas Sirota or whoever. And I think that actually that kind of nepotism, I'm going to call it what it is surprisingly common especially in like the upper reaches of the nationals and the big organizations. And so if you're coming from a background where you don't know anyone who works in museums at all, and you don't have those connections, that's a gaping chasm of experience. But to come back to your question about how networks can help, I think that there's a really great example in the charity Arts Emergency, who call themselves an alternative old boys network. And they set up mentoring relationships for young people from disadvantaged backgrounds with people who work in the creative sectors. And I think that is quite a good model. But of course, they're a sort of grassroots organisation, but they are a charity, they have funding, they have employees, and Museum as Muck is a very small group, and similar to you guys at Fair Museum Jobs, it's just us volunteering our time as the steering group. And I should say we are recruiting for new steering group members. So hopefully one of the other muckers who's watching can share the link. So if people are interested, do get in touch. Sorry, that was a bit of a tangent from your question, but we there's a lot that we want to work on and achieve. So yeah, we need people to kind of muck in and work together.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point about actually doing, we are, a lot of grassroots networks are trying to do this together and get the change that we want. And that brings me on to a question that is in the chat and comes into something that we'd talked about in advance, which is if you don't perceive yourself to be in a position of power, for example, you're in an entry-level role, what can you do the suggestion here is pressuring your institution into leveling the playing field, but what else can you do in a personal way that might affect change? I wonder if any of my panelists would like to weigh. Vicky.
That's a really interesting question that caught my eye. I think if I was Molly and surrounded by people who were privileged and felt like I couldn't speak out, I think it would be, you're in a tricky position, aren't you? If you try to call them out, will it backfire on you, and will it make you look bad? From personal experience on Twitter, I would ask for support from Fair Museum Jobs, really. I think the amount of work that they've done in changing recruitment for a lot of museums, just calling them out on their adverts and their recruitment policies. I think you've managed to change so many job specs and job criteria just by simply being vocal about it. I think as an individual, it's really hard to do, because I feel like it's quite a pity in a very awkward position. But for an organisation like Fair Museum Jobs, I think you've been really effective in changing the way that many small and national museums have recruited. I've noticed that recent examples, salaries have gone from being shown as competitive to actually stating what the salaries are, and I think that would be really effective in my opinion.
Thanks, Vicky. I was not fishing for a Fair Museum Jobs shout out in the question, but you are right to say that actually it comes back to precarity again. If you are in a precarious situation, don't beat yourself up if you can't speak out. You're not always going to be able to, and that's okay. That doesn't mean you assess every situation that you're in and do the best you can. And if you need to call in somebody else to help you, then that's absolutely the best course of action. I'm definitely not wanting anyone to go away from this feeling guilty that they're not doing enough. That's not the point of this. And also there's a really important reflection about emotional labor here as well. And I'm going to come to you, Kathleen, deliberately on emotional labor, because I know that you have already shared with me some thoughts about it.
Thank you, Louise. Glad to hear that I'm now the emotional labor woman as well as the poor woman and the
sorry, I'm so sorry.
That's fine. Yes, so sorry, can you just rephrase the question? Because
there's the emotional labor of trying to affect change.
Yeah.
Can't always be on the same people. How can we make sure it gets shared out, and what can we do about it?
Yeah. So this touches on something that I was reflecting on following your earlier session this week about anti-racism and about being being perceived as difficult in meetings or in other scenarios where you're calling out things which you recognize as being problematic. And unfortunately, I don't think there is an easy answer. Like I tweeted kind of offhand, like if being difficult was easy, everyone would be doing it. Like it's actually, it is difficult to be the one that says, wait a minute, that's not right. Or you shouldn't be doing that or saying that. So in a way, I think we have to practice being uncomfortable and putting ourselves out there. I think similarly to white museum workers being allies to people of colour, I think, middle class or other people who don't consider themselves to be working class should also be being allies to working class colleagues, which is that if you notice something that doesn't sit right with you, say something. And it's going to be difficult. And if it were, as I say, if it was easy, we'd all be doing it. But also make sure that you do have those networks around you. And I think that is one of the things that Museum as Muck is really useful for, is that if you've had an experience where you've called something out at work, or even if you haven't said something and you're feeling a mixture of feelings of, having your kind of feelings hurt by whatever the kind of thing was, and also then feeling guilty that you haven't said anything. If you've got a network like Museum as Muck of like-minded people with similar experiences, that's so valuable to talk about it afterwards. And as you say, I think you shouldn't, it's kind of a difficult balance that we should all be trying to call this stuff out, but don't beat yourself up feeling guilty if you were not able to do it in the moment because it's really tough. And that was something one of your panel the other day on anti-racism talked about, is like the decisions you make in the moment when an incident occurs, that it's not always possible to work through it and to do what you want to say at the time. So I think that's something that we just need to be aware of and work on, and all, like, no one's perfect. We've all got to be self-aware and working towards getting better.
Absolutely. I think that's been reflected actually in quite a few of our panels this week in anti-racism. Last night we had a panel about personal values, and actually accepting that you don't have to embody your personal values 100% of the time. We're all human, and not every moment of our lives can we give 100%. Sometimes, and you have to give yourself that permission in a lot of ways, I think, and accept that you might be an activist, but you can't always be an activist in every scenario and know exactly how to refute someone when they're telling you to do something that you can see is going to have a negative impact. You can just do your best. And I think finding allies is really important. In another session, the idea, actually in the yes to failure session, the idea of a team me came up from one of our panelists, and finding that support, whether it's individuals or networks, and it doesn't have to be people in museums, it could be your family, your partner, your friends. Like, your team doesn't have to understand the ins and outs of collections documentation to be on your team. You know, they don't have to know everything about your work. I'm going to come to one of our other questions, and I'm going to come to Lorraine on this question first. And that question is, could you comment your thoughts or experiences of balancing the opportunity provided by offering volunteer positions versus the ethics of excluding people from backgrounds that can't afford to work for free? And the question posed by the person who submitted that is, are we devaluing our own sector? But I think in a wider sense, what's the impact?
My answer to that is 100% yes. I have a very strong dislike of people feeling they have to do unpaid internship and volunteer work before they can get a foot in the door. And I have to say, I did when I between my bachelor's degree and my master's degree, I was working full time, and I did, say, half a day a week at Norfolk Museum Service for something like 3 to 6 months. I can't remember now. To find out what the sector was like. And that was really the reason for doing it. And that's the last time I did unpaid voluntary work. I did 3 paid internships before I got my first job in conservation, but that was whilst I was training. And so 100%, I really disagree with people having to do unpaid volunteer work and unpaid internships. Yes, I still do volunteer work, if you think about the work that I do to support my professional body. So I'm a trustee and director of the Institute of Conservation, so that's unremunerated. I'm also on the Professional Standards and Development Steering Committee, and I'm chair of the Environmental Sustainability Network. But I want to do that. No, I'm not feeling that I have to do that in order to progress my career. I want to do it because I want to support my profession. So I feel that that is something entirely different. But yes, that is still unpaid voluntary work. I did speak to somebody who was in the library sector, and museum sector. So she spent 3 years doing various different unpaid work before she even got a part-time position in a museum. And that's just wrong. It's wrong. And it excludes so many people. I'm not saying I've got the answer, but I think it's wrong.
Vicky, I wonder if you could reflect on this for us as well.
Yeah, I'd probably just add to Lorraine's point that I volunteer at a museum because I want to, not because I feel like it's essential as part of my career. I think I've got mixed feelings about volunteering, because I think in some ways it's good to get, there's a clear difference in my opinion between an internship, a job, and casual volunteering. And I think that's where the fluidity and mistakes happen, is when employers basically create a job role that is unpaid. And I think that needs to be addressed and changed. And I think, I know, I was just thinking about a personal experience I had when I was trying to get into the museum sector. And I won't name and shame the museum, but I applied to be, and this was when I didn't get into university, I applied to be a casual front of house volunteer, and they said that I couldn't be a volunteer front of house because I didn't have a degree, and I needed a degree to show people around the museum, which is just so bizarre. But yeah, I think there needs to be clear distinctions between casual volunteering and internships, which are clearly jobs when they ask for degrees and masters and everything else. And I think that needs to be more clear. But I obviously, like, having done an apprenticeship, I've obviously like worked a lower paid job, and the only way that I could get around that was by working nights and weekends doing other stuff. And I think things are a bit better than they were a few years ago, but I think we should just stop unpaid internships, give them a basic salary, and just stop being so unfair with recruitment.
Yeah, I mean, if anyone's going to take any point away from this, stop being unfair in recruitment is absolutely the point, because everyone benefits. No matter who you are, you benefit from it being more fair. Absolutely. I'm going to come on to one question that I'd like the thought to kind of for everyone to leave this session with, and the question I'd like to ask is, what can we go away and do now as a sector or as an individual, one thing that could make a big difference to take away from this discussion? I'm going to come to Lorraine first.
Talk to one another, speak up if you feel comfortable to do that, but talk.
Thank you. Excellent advice, definitely. Kathleen, what would you suggest?
I'm going to say a sector one, which is pay the real living wage, not the national living wage. The Living Wage Foundation's set wage for any job that you're hiring someone to do, people should be able to earn a living from doing that job. Absolutely,
100% agree yeah, I mean, there's no negotiation. That is just true. And Vicky, the final thought from you.
Oh no, they said what I was going to already. Yeah, probably just what I just said earlier, like, stop being so unfair with recruitment. Like, don't demand a degree for an entry-level role. Why are museum entry-level roles so difficult to get into? It's nuts. So just be more fair.
Thank you. I think that really sums up our feelings on everything. There are some questions we didn't get to, and there's a lot more in this issue. There's a lot of links been posted in the chat. So please, I'm just going to say, you can save the chat by clicking on the dots next to the chat box and clicking save chat, so you can read all those reports, look at the links Kathleen put in, and various website links. So please do save that and go away and learn more about what the situation is and what you can do. There's a lot of lovely thank yous coming in on the chat to our panelists. So I would like to echo all of those and say thank you so much for spending some of your Sunday with us to talk about these issues. Go and find Museum as Muck on Facebook and Twitter. Join their steering group. The more people there are, the more change can happen. Absolutely. And thank you all so much for joining me today.